When he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come and see." So I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius. And do not harm the oil and the wine." The first thing that must be understood to unlock this prophecy is a quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius. A denarius was a day's wages in the Roman Empire. If you lived alone you would work for 1 day, then buy a quart of wheat to eat. If you had a family you would have to buy lower quality food. Barely. Either way you could never get ahead because the system is created to control and suck the blood out of the masses. If you got sick or lost your job you may starve. In modern times we call it living paycheck to paycheck. Remember, these horses are powers in the earth. In 2008 America and the world got a taste of this black horse. Record foreclosures. The worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. If you look into both of these crises you will find that the same system is behind both of them. The second part to look at is, do not harm the oil and the wine. Now this can be looked at in 2 ways. 1, that the richest ensure that they will keep their dominance and you will not reach their level. 2, they will control the oil, petroleum, and the lifestyle mentioned in 1. Either way it is basically the same. The last part is, he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. This shows us the controlling of the markets, setting the value of virtually everything in reality. You may have figured out what this power in the earth is by now. Either way, let's look at some of the effects this power has over America before we uncover exactly what it is.
There's a chart I saw recently that I can't get out of my head. A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000 Americans how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 rough groups of the top, bottom, and middle 3 20% groups, they asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution. And 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly, the notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution. Shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing. But let's look at it another way, because I find this chart kind of difficult to wrap my head around. Instead, let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are: teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or 2. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right, just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward. So, here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change, and the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own, because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976, they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money. But do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.
The Federal Reserve, a privately owned central banking cartel taking multi-trillion-dollar bailouts on taxpayer money, charging taxpayers interest on money printed out of thin air since 1913. Yacht for me, foreclosed home for you. Did you know the Federal Reserve is privately owned? President Bush admits the Federal Reserve is privately owned but states that it's good for the economy. The Federal Reserve is not part of the federal government. It is a corporation made up of a group of private bankers whose members are not disclosed to our government or the people. The United States government has no say over Fed's policies, nor do they have any auditing rights. The Fed's books are not open for inspection. The Feds determine our money's value and charges interest for letting us use their money, all of which is unconstitutional. The Feds also steal true wealth, our labor, from us by driving inflation, printing more money with no gold or silver backing from thin air, which effectively dilutes the value of what you have in your pocket or saved in the bank. They print our money with interest. How can it ever be paid back? Answer: impossible. Now let us look at some quotes from reliable sources. Banking was conceived in iniquity, and born in sin. Bankers own the earth. Take it away from them, but leave them the power to create money, and with the flick of a pen, they will create enough money to buy it back again. Take this great power away from them, and all great fortunes like mine will disappear. And they ought to disappear, for then this would be a better and happier world to live in. But if you want to continue to be the slaves of the bankers, and pay the cost of your own slavery, then let bankers continue to create money, and control credit. Abraham Lincoln: I have two great enemies, the Southern Army in front of me and the bankers in the rear. Of the two, the one at my rear is my greatest foe. As a further undesirable consequence of the war, corporations have been enthroned, and an era of corruption in high places will follow. The money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until the wealth is aggregated in the hands of a few, and the republic is destroyed. Abraham Lincoln: the financial system has been turned over to the Federal Reserve Board. That board administers the finance system by authority of a purely profiteering group. The system is private, conducted for the sole purpose of obtaining the greatest possible profits from the use of other people's money. Charles A. Lindbergh Sr., 1923. Those who create and issue money and credit direct the policies of government and hold in the hollow of their hands the destiny of the people. Rude Honorable Reginald McKenna, former Chancellor of Exchequer, England. The few who understand the system will either be so interested from its profits or so dependent on its favors that there will be no opposition from that class. Rothschild Brothers of London, 1863. Give me control of a nation's money and I care not who makes its laws. Mayor Amschel Bauer Rothschild. Most Americans have no real understanding of the operation of the international money lenders. The accounts of the Federal Reserve System have never been audited. It operates outside the control of Congress and manipulates the credit of the United States. Senator Barry Goldwater, Representative Arizona. This Federal Reserve Act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the President Wilson signs this bill, the invisible government of the monetary power will be legalized. The worst legislative crime of the ages is perpetrated by this banking and currency bill. Congressman Charles A. Lindbergh, Sr., 1913. From now on, depressions will be scientifically created. Congressman Charles A. Lindbergh, Sr., 1913. The Federal Reserve Bank buys government bonds without one penny. Congressman Wright Patman, Congressional Record, September 30, 1941. As soon as Mr. Roosevelt took office, the Federal Reserve began to buy government securities at the rate of $10 million a week for 10 weeks, and created $100 million in new checkbook currency. Eustace Mullins: it is well that the people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system, for if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning. Henry Ford: we have, in this country, one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever known. I refer to the Federal Reserve Board. This evil institution has impoverished the people of the United States and has practically bankrupted our government. It has done this through the corrupt practices of the moneyed vultures who control it. Congressman Louis T. McFadden in 1932, Representative Pennsylvania. I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. Already they have raised up a moneyed aristocracy that has set the government at defiance. The issuing power of money should be taken away from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs. Thomas Jefferson, the United States President. History records that the money changers have used every form of abuse, intrigue, deceit, and violent means possible to maintain their control over governments by controlling money and its issuance. James Madison.
Mayer Amschel Rothschild died in Frankfurt in 1812. His empire grew through his family. Perhaps the one quote in modern English which sums up Mayer Rothschild's ambitions is this: "Give me control of a nation's money supply, and I care not who makes its laws." Towards the end of his life, Mayer told his 5 sons that they should expand the Rothschild banking empire throughout Europe. Nathan was sent to London. Amschel stayed in Frankfurt. Solomon went to Vienna. Karl traveled to Naples. James stayed in Paris. The establishment of the 5 centers of the Rothschild banking family is symbolized by the 5 arrows in the Rothschild family crest. The alliance between the Rothschilds and Illuminized Freemasonry continued with this new generation. Freemasonry was a common element with Adam Weishaupt, 3 of the 5 Rothschild brothers, and Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was initiated into Freemasonry in June 1798. Napoleon was part of the Inner Masonic Club, but his imperialist ambitions could not be contained. Keep in mind that Napoleon appointed himself as King of France in December 1804. Napoleon enjoyed immense success as Emperor of France, yet his policies contained a fatal flaw. Napoleon's Banque de France, which would provide interest-free loans to the people of France, was a direct threat to the Rothschild banking empire. The Rothschilds decided to defeat Napoleon's army, not through military conquest, but by financial dominance. Napoleon needed so much money to finance his war that he agreed to sell all French territory in America through the Louisiana Purchase of 1804. Nathan Rothschild in England took Prince William's money transferred to Amschel Rothschild in Germany and used it to fund British forces. Jacob Rothschild in France was one of several banks helping to fund Napoleon's army. This means that the Rothschilds were busy funding both sides of the War of 1812. The modern financial system, started by the Rothschilds, has been funding both sides of every major war for 200 years. While the Battle of Waterloo was a defeat for Napoleon, it was also a guarantee of financial domination for the Rothschilds. Because the Rothschilds had a network of banking couriers throughout Europe, they were the only merchants allowed to pass through the English and French blockades. One of these couriers crossed the English Channel with the news that Wellington had won the war, a full 24 hours before Wellington's own courier. Nathan Rothschild knew that he was armed with this critical information before anyone else was. He ordered his workers to start selling holdings of British war bonds. Other traders observed this false maneuver and started selling their bonds in a panic. The bonds became worthless as everyone thought that Rothschild's action meant that Napoleon had won the war. Nathan Rothschild then instructed his traders to buy all the British bonds they could get. When London heard the news that England won the war against Napoleon, British bonds gained a level of value even higher than before the war began. The ownership of such a vast sum of high-value bonds meant that the Rothschilds literally owned the Bank of England. On top of all this, there were the profits to be made from loans to Europe to repair the damage done by Napoleon. From the Battle of Waterloo onwards, the interests of the British Crown and the Rothschilds were so intertwined that the Rothschilds were given titles of nobility. Eventually, through intermarriage, the Rothschilds became royalty. In 1791, Alexander Hamilton established the first privately owned central bank in the United States, with $10 million on a 20-year charter. This is contrary to the United States Constitution, which Hamilton signed. When the charter expired, the head of this private group was revealed. None other than Nathan Rothschild in England said, "Either the application for the renewal of the charter is granted, or the United States will find itself in a most disastrous war." The United States repelled the British on American soil within 1 year of Nathan Rothschild's pronouncement during the War of 1812. Fortunately for America, Britain was tied up fighting Napoleon in Europe and couldn't send enough troops to reclaim America. While America won a military victory, its financial back was broken. The War of 1812 forced the rechartering of the Private Bank of the United States. Thanks to the war and inflation, the debt owed to the bank exploded to $127 million. Andrew Jackson vetoed the bank in 1832. In 1835, President Jackson distributed a $35 million surplus. This was the only time in American history that the United States had balanced its books. The Rothschilds had their sights set on reclaiming America. A divide and conquer strategy would be used by creating a conflict between the North and the South. The North was to be a British colony annexed to Canada under the control of Lionel Rothschild. The South was to be a French colony given to Napoleon III of France under the control of James Rothschild. Lincoln's main problem shifted from slavery, which he outlawed, to how he was going to pay for the defense of America against the international bankers who were destroying it. Lincoln came up with a brilliant solution called the greenback. The government would print its own interest-free currency that would later be redeemable in gold. The bankers wouldn't stand for this. On April 14, 1865, 5 days after the South surrendered, Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth. Booth was a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle.
(1775), the American Revolutionary War began as the American colonies sought to detach from England and its oppressive monarchy. Though many reasons are cited for the revolution, one in particular sticks out as the prime cause: that King George III of England outlawed the interest-free, independent currency the colonies were producing and using for themselves, in turn forcing them to borrow money from the Central Bank of England at interest, immediately putting the colonies into debt. And, as Benjamin Franklin later wrote, the refusal of King George III to allow the colonies to operate an honest money system which freed the ordinary man from the clutches of the money manipulators was probably the prime cause of the Revolution. In 1783, America won its independence from England. However, its battle against the central bank concept and the corrupt, greed-filled men associated with it had just begun. So what is a central bank? A central bank is an institution that produces the currency of an entire nation. Based on historical precedent, two specific powers are inherent in central banking practice: the control of interest rates and the control of the money supply, or inflation. The central bank does not simply supply a government's economy with money, it loans it to them at interest. Then, through the use of increasing and decreasing the supply of money, the central bank regulates the value of the currency being issued. It is critical to understand that the entire structure of this system can only produce one thing in the long run: debt. It doesn't take a lot of ingenuity to figure this scam out. For every single dollar produced by the central bank is loaned at interest. That means every single dollar produced is actually the dollar plus a certain percent of debt based on that dollar. And since the central bank has the monopoly over the production of the currency for the entire country, and they loan each dollar out with immediate debt attached to it, where does the money to pay for the debt come from? It can only come from the central bank again. which means the central bank has to perpetually increase its money supply to temporarily cover the outstanding debt created, which in turn, since that new money is loaned out at interest as well, creates even more debt. The end result of this system without fail is slavery, for it is impossible for the government and thus the public to ever come out of the self-generating debt. The founding fathers of this country were well aware of this. By the early 20th century, the U.S. had already implemented and removed a few central banking systems, which were swindled into place by ruthless banking interests. At this time, the dominant families in the banking and business world were the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Warburgs, the Rothschilds. And in the early 1900s, they sought to push once again legislation to create another central bank. However, they knew the government and public were very weary of such an institution, so they needed to create an incident to affect public opinion. So, J.P. Morgan, publicly considered a financial luminary at the time, exploited his mass influence by publishing rumors that a prominent bank in New York was insolvent or bankrupt. Morgan knew this would cause mass hysteria, which would affect other banks as well. And it did. The public, in fear of losing their deposits, immediately began mass withdrawals. Consequently, the banks were forced to call in their loans, causing the recipients to sell their property, and thus a spiral of bankruptcies, repossessions, and turmoil emerged. Putting the pieces together a few years later, Frederick Allen of Life magazine wrote, "The Morgan interests took advantage to precipitate the panic, guiding it shrewdly as it progressed." Unaware of the fraud, the Panic of 1907 led to a congressional investigation headed by Senator Nelson Aldrich, who had intimate ties to the banking cartels and later became part of the Rockefeller family through marriage. The commission, led by Aldrich, recommended a central bank should be implemented so a panic like 1907 could never happen again. This was the spark the international bankers needed to initiate their plan. In 1910, a secret meeting was held at a J.P. Morgan estate on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. It was there that the central banking bill called the Federal Reserve Act was written. This legislation was written by bankers, not lawmakers. This meeting was so secretive, so concealed from government and public knowledge, that the 10 or so figures who attended were told they could only use their first names in addressing each other. After this bill was constructed, it was then handed over to their political frontman, Senator Nelson Aldrich, to push through Congress. And in 1913, with heavy political sponsorship by the bankers, Woodrow Wilson became president, having already agreed to sign the Federal Reserve Act in exchange for campaign support. And 2 days before Christmas, when most of Congress was at home with their families, the Federal Reserve Act was voted in, and Wilson in turn made it law. Years later, Woodrow Wilson wrote, in regret, Congressman Louis McFadden also expressed the truth after the passage of the bill. A world banking system was being set up here, a superstate controlled by international bankers, acting together to enslave the world for their own pleasure. The Fed has usurped the government. Now, the public was told that the Federal Reserve System was an economic stabilizer, and inflation and economic crises were a thing of the past. Well, as history has shown, nothing is further from the truth. The fact is, the international bankers now had a streamlined machine to expand their personal ambitions.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
For example, from 1914 to 1919, the Fed increased the money supply by nearly 100%, resulting in extensive loans to small banks and the public. Then, in 1920, the Fed called in mass percentages of the outstanding money supply, thus resulting in the supporting banks having to call in huge numbers of loans, and, just like 1907, bank runs, bankruptcy, and collapse occurred. over 5,400 competitive banks outside of the Federal Reserve System collapsed, further consolidating the monopoly of a small group. Privy to this crime, Congressman Lindbergh stepped up and said in 1921, "Under the Federal Reserve Act, panics are scientifically created. The present panic is the first scientifically created one, worked out as we figure a mathematical equation." However, the panic of 1920 was just a warm-up. From 1921 to 1929, the Fed again increased the money supply, resulting once again in extensive loans to the public and banks. There was also a fairly new type of loan called a margin loan in the stock market. Very simply, the margin loan allowed an investor to put down only 10% of a stock's price, with the other 90% being loaned through the broker. In other words, a person could own $1,000 worth of stock with only $100 down. This method was very popular in the roaring 1920s, as everyone seemed to be making money in the market. However, there was a catch to this loan. It could be called in at any time and had to be paid within 24 hours. This is termed a margin call, and the typical result of a margin call is the selling of the stock purchased with the loan. So, a few months before October in 1929, J.D. Rockefeller, Bernard Baruch, and other insiders quietly exited the market, and on October 24th, 1929, the New York financiers who furnished the margin loans started calling them in masse. This sparked an instantaneous, massive sell-off in the market, for everyone had to cover the margin loans. It then triggered mass bank runs for the same reason, in turn collapsing over 16,000 banks, enabling the conspiring international bankers to not only buy up rival banks at a discount, but to also buy up whole corporations at pennies on the dollar. It was the greatest robbery in American history. But that didn't stop there. Rather than expanding the money supply in order to recover from this economic collapse, the Fed actually contracted it, fueling one of the largest depressions in history. Once again outraged, Congressman Louis McFadden, a longtime opponent of the banking cartels, began bringing impeachment proceedings against the Federal Reserve Board, saying of the crash and depression, "It was a carefully contrived occurrence. International bankers sought to bring about a condition of despair so that they might emerge the rulers of us all." Not surprisingly, and after 2 previous assassination attempts, McFadden was poisoned at a banquet before he could push for the impeachment. Now, having reduced the society to squalor, the Federal Reserve bankers decided that the gold standard should be removed. In order to do this, they needed to acquire the remaining gold in the system. So, under the pretense of helping to end the Depression, came the 1933 gold seizure. Under the threat of imprisonment for 10 years, everyone in America was required to turn in all gold bullion to the Treasury, essentially robbing the public of what little wealth they had left. And at the end of 1933, the gold standard was abolished. If you look at a dollar bill from before 1933, it says it is redeemable in gold. If you look at a dollar bill today, it says it is legal tender, which means it is backed by absolutely nothing. It is worthless paper. The only thing that gives our money value is how much of it is in circulation. Therefore, the power to regulate the money supply is also the power to regulate its value, which is also the power to bring entire economies and societies to its knees. It's important to clearly understand, the Federal Reserve is a private corporation. It is about as Federal Express. It makes its own policies and is under virtually no regulation by the U.S. government. It is a private bank that loans all the currency at interest to the government, completely consistent with the fraudulent central banking model that the country sought to escape from when it declared independence in the American Revolutionary War. Now, going back to 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was not the only unconstitutional bill pushed through Congress. They also pushed the federal income tax. It's worthwhile to point out that the American public's ignorance towards the federal income tax is a testament to how dumbed down and oblivious the American population really is. First of all, the federal income tax is completely unconstitutional, as it is a direct, unapportioned tax. All direct taxes have to be apportioned to be legal based on the Constitution. Secondly, the required number of states in order to ratify the amendment to allow the income tax was never met, and this has even been cited in modern court cases. Third, at the present day, roughly 35% of the average worker's income is taken from them via this tax. That means you work 4 months out of the year to fulfill this tax obligation. And guess where that money goes? It goes to pay the interest on the currency being produced by the fraudulent Federal Reserve Bank, a system that does not have to exist at all. Not 1 cent of this tax goes towards any governmental program whatsoever. Not 1 cent. The money you make working 4 months out of the year goes almost literally into the pockets of the international bankers who own the private Federal Reserve Bank. And fourth, even with the fraudulent government claim as to the legality of the income tax, there is literally no statute, no law in existence that requires you to pay this tax. Period.
I really expected that, of course, there's a law that you can point to in the law book, the code that requires you to file a tax return. Of course there is. I was at that point where I couldn't find the statute that clearly made a person liable, at least not me and most people I know, and I had no choice in my mind except to resign.
Based on the research that I did throughout the year 2000 and that I'm still doing, I have not found that law. I've asked Congress, we've asked a lot of people in the IRS commissioners, helpers. They can't answer, because if they answer, the American people are going to know that this whole thing is a fraud.
I haven't filed an federal income tax return since I left.
I have not filed a tax return since 1999.
The income tax is nothing less than the enslavement of the entire country. Now, the control of the economy and the perpetual robbery of wealth is only one side of the Rubik's Cube the bankers hold in their hands. The next tool for profit and control is war. Since the inception of the Federal Reserve in 1913, a number of large and small wars have commenced. The three most pronounced were World War I, World War II, and Vietnam. World War I. In 1914, European wars broke out centered around England and Germany. The American public wanted nothing to do with the war. In turn, President Woodrow Wilson publicly declared neutrality. However, under the surface, the U.S. administration was looking for any excuse it could find to enter it. Woodrow Wilson's top advisor and mentor was Colonel Edward House, a man with intimate connections with the international bankers who wanted to end the war. In a noted observation by Secretary of State William Jennings, the large banking interests were deeply interested in the World War because of the wide opportunities for large profits. It's important to understand that the most lucrative thing that can happen for the international bankers is war, for it forces the country to borrow even more money from the Federal Reserve Bank at interest. In a documented conversation between Colonel House, Wilson's advisor, and Sir Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary of England, regarding how to get America into the war, Grey inquired, "What will Americans do if Germans sink an ocean liner with American passengers on board?" House responded, "I believe that a flame of indignation would sweep the United States, and that by itself would be sufficient to carry us into war." So, on May 7, 1915, on essentially the suggestion of Sir Edward Grey, a ship called the Lusitania was deliberately sent into German-controlled waters where German military vessels were known to be. And, as expected, German U-boats torpedoed the ship, exploding stored ammunition, sinking it in 18 minutes, killing 1,200 people. To further understand the deliberate nature of this setup, the German embassy actually put advertisements in the New York Times telling people that if they boarded the Lusitania, they did so at their own risk, as such a ship sailing from America to England through the war zone would be liable to destruction. In turn, and as anticipated, the sinking of the Lusitania caused a wave of anger among the American population, and America entered the war a short time after. The First World War caused 323,000 American deaths. J.D. Rockefeller made $200 million off of it. That's about $1.9 trillion by today's standards. Not to mention the war cost about $30 billion for America, most of which was borrowed from the Federal Reserve Bank at interest, furthering the profits of the international bankers. World War II. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, triggering our entry into that war. President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared the attack was a day that will live in infamy. A day of infamy indeed, but not because of the alleged surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. After 60 years of surfacing information, it is clear that not only was the attack on Pearl Harbor known weeks in advance, it was outright wanted and provoked. Roosevelt, whose family had been New York bankers since the 18th century, whose uncle Frederick was on the original Federal Reserve Board, was very sympathetic to the interests of the international bankers, and the interest was to enter the war, as we've seen, nothing is more profitable for international bankers than war. In a journal entry by Roosevelt's Secretary of War Henry Stimson, dated November 25, 1941, he documented a conversation he had with Roosevelt. The question was, how should we maneuver them into firing the first shot? It was desirable to make sure the Japanese be the ones to do this, so that there should remain no doubt as to who were the aggressors. In the months leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt had done almost everything in his power to anger the Japanese, showing a posture of aggression. He halted all of Japan's imports of American petroleum. He froze all the Japanese assets in the United States. He made public loans to nationalist China and supplied military aid to the British, both enemies of Japan in the war, which, by the way, is completely in violation of international war rules. And on December 4th, 3 days before the attack, Australian intelligence told Roosevelt about a Japanese task force moving towards Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt ignored it. So, as hoped and allowed, on December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, killing 2,400 soldiers. Before Pearl Harbor, 83% of the American public wanted nothing to do with the war. After Pearl Harbor, 1 million men volunteered for the war. It is important to note, Nazi Germany's war effort was largely supported by two organizations, one of which was called IG Farben. IG Farben produced 84% of Germany's explosives, and even the Zyklon B used in the concentration camps to kill millions. One of the unspoken partners of IG Farben was J.D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company in America. In fact, the German Air Force could not operate without a special additive patented by Rockefeller's Standard Oil. The drastic bombing of London by Nazi Germany, for example, was made possible by a $20 million sale of fuel to IG Farben by the Rockefeller Standard Oil Company. This is just one small point on the topic of how American business funded both sides of World War II. One other treasonous organization worth mentioning is the Union Banking Corporation of New York City. Not only did it finance numerous aspects of Hitler's rise to power, along with actual materials during the war, it was also a Nazi money laundering bank, which was eventually exposed for having millions of dollars of Nazi money in its vaults. The Union Banking Corporation of New York was eventually seized for violations of the Trading with the Enemy Act. Guess who the director and vice president of the Union Bank was? Prescott Bush, our current president's grandfather, and of course our former president's father. Keep that in mind when considering the moral and political dispositions of the Bush family. Vietnam. The United States' official declaration of war on North Vietnam in 1964 came after an alleged incident involving two U.S. destroyers being attacked by North Vietnamese PT boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. This was known as the Gulf of Tonkin Incident. This single situation was the catalytic pretext for massive troop deployment and full-fledged warfare. One problem, however, the attack on the U.S. destroyers by Vietnamese PT boats never happened. It was a completely staged event to have an excuse to enter the war. Former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara stated years later that the Gulf of Tonkin incident was a mistake, while many other insiders and officers have come forward, relaying that it was a contrived farce, a complete lie. Once in the war, it was business as usual. In October 1966, President Lyndon Johnson lifted trading restrictions on the Soviet bloc, knowing full well that the Soviets were providing upwards of 80% of North Vietnam's war supplies. Consequently, Rockefeller interests financed factories in the Soviet Union, which the Soviets used to manufacture military equipment and send it to North Vietnam. However, the funding of both sides of this conflict was only one side of the coin. In 1985, Vietnam's rules of engagement were declassified. This detailed what American troops were and were not allowed to do in the war. It included absurdities like North Vietnamese anti-aircraft missile systems could not be bombed until they were known to be fully operational. No enemy could be pursued once they crossed the border of Laos or Cambodia. And most revealing of all, the most critical strategic targets were not allowed to be attacked unless initiated by high military officials. Apart from these imposed ludicrous limitations, North Vietnam was informed of these restrictions and therefore could base entire strategies around the limitations of the American forces. This is why the war went on so long. And the bottom line is this: the Vietnam War was never meant to be won, just sustained. This war for profit resulted in 58,000 American deaths and 3 million dead Vietnamese. So, where are we now? September 11th was the jumpstart for what is now an accelerated agenda by the ruthless elite. It was a staged war pretext no different than the sinking of the Lusitania, the provoking of Pearl Harbor, and the Gulf of Tonkin lie. In fact, if 9/11 wasn't a planned war pretext, it would be an exception to the rule. It has been used to launch 2 unprovoked illegal wars, one against Iraq and one against Afghanistan. However, 9/11 was a pretext for another war as well, the war against you. The Patriot Act, Homeland Security, the Military Tribunals Act, and other legislations are all completely and entirely designed to destroy your civil liberties and limit your ability to fight back against what is coming. Currently in the United States, unannounced to most brainwashed Americans, your home can be searched without a warrant, without you being home. You can in turn be arrested with no charges revealed to you, detained indefinitely with no access to a lawyer, and legally tortured, all under the suspicion that you might be a terrorist. If you need a painted picture of what is happening in this country, let's recognize how history repeats itself. In February 1933, Hitler staged a false flag attack, burning down his own German parliament building, the Reichstag, and blamed it on communist terrorists. In the next few weeks, he passed the Enabling Act, which completely eradicated the German Constitution, destroying people's liberties. He then led a series of preemptive wars, all justified to the German people as necessary to maintaining homeland security.
Our enemy is a radical network of terrorists and every government that supports them.
It's time to wake up. The people in power go out of their way to make sure that you are perpetually misled and manipulated. The majority's perception of reality, especially in the political arena, is not their own. It is shrewdly imposed upon them without them even knowing it. For example, the public at large actually believes the invasion of Iraq is going badly, as sectarian violence doesn't seem to stop. What the public fails to see is that the destabilization of Iraq is exactly what the people behind the government want. This war is to be sustained so the region can be divided up, domination of the oil maintained, continual profits reaped for the defense contractors, and most importantly, permanent military bases established to be used as a launching pad against other oil-bearing, non-conforming countries such as Iran and Syria. For further implication that the civil war and destabilization is purely intentional, in 2005, 2 elite British SAS officers were arrested by Iraqi police after being caught driving around in their car shooting at civilians while dressed up as Arabs. After being arrested and taken to a jail in Basra, the British Army immediately requested the release of these men. When the Basra government refused, British tanks came in and physically broke out the men from the Basra prison.
If you wish to destroy an area, how do you do it? Well, there are 2 ways. You can go in there and bomb it and so forth, but that is not very efficient. What you do is you try to get the people in that area to kill each other and to destroy their own territory, their own farms. And that's what's been done in that area. The way in which you destroy an opponent is get him to destroy himself by dividing his ranks against one another. Then you feed both sides. You have agents feeding both sides, inflaming both sides, and they kill each other off. And it's time that some of us woke up to this reality, to understand that people who try to maintain empires and create empires do it by manipulating the people they're trying.
You might want to ask yourself why the entire culture is utterly saturated with mass media entertainment from all sides. while the educational system in America continues its stupefying downward slide since the U.S. government decided to take over and subsidize the public school system.
What your government pays for, it gets. When we understand that, then we look at government-financed institutions of education and see the kind of students and the kind of education that's being turned out by these government-financed schools. Logic will tell you that if what is being turned out in those schools was not in accord with what the state and the federal government wanted, then it would change it. The bottom line is that the government is getting what they have ordered. They do not want your children to be educated. They do not want you to think too much. That is why our country and our world has become so proliferated with entertainments, mass media, television shows, amusement parks, drugs, alcohol, and every kind of entertainment to keep the human mind entertained, so that you don't get in the way of important people by doing too much thinking. You had better wake up and understand that there are people who are guiding your life and you don't even know it.
We're in a lot of trouble because you people and 62 million other Americans are listening to me right now, because less than 3% of you people read books, because less than 15% of you read newspapers, because the only truth you know is what you get over this tube. Right now, there is an entire generation that never knew anything that didn't come out of this tube. This tube is the gospel, the ultimate revelation. This tube can make or break presidents, popes, prime ministers. This tube is the most awesome goddamn force in the whole godless world. And woe is us if it ever falls into the hands of the wrong people. And when the largest company in the world controls the most awesome goddamn propaganda force in the whole godless world, who knows what shit will be peddled for truth on this network. So you listen to me. Listen to me. Television is not the truth. Television is a goddamn amusement park. Television is a circus, a carnival, a traveling troupe of acrobats, storytellers, dancers, singers, jugglers, sideshow freaks, lion tamers, and football players. We're in the boredom-killing business. But you people sit there day after day, night after night, all ages, colors, creeds. We're all you know. You're beginning to believe the illusions we're spinning here. You're beginning to think that the tube is reality and that your own lives are unreal. You do whatever the tube tells you. You dress like the tube. You eat like the tube. You raise your children like the tube. You even think like the tube. This is mass madness, you maniacs. In God's name, you people are the real thing. We are the illusion.
The last thing the men behind the curtain want is a conscious, informed public capable of critical thinking, which is why a continually fraudulent zeitgeist is output via religion, the mass media, and the educational system. They seek to keep you in a distracted, naive bubble, and they are doing a damn good job of it. In 2005, an arrangement between Canada, Mexico, and the United States was made. This arrangement, unannounced to the public, unregulated by Congress, merges the United States, Mexico, and Canada into one entity, erasing all borders. It's called the North American Union, and you might want to ask yourself why you've never heard of this. In fact, there is only one mainstream reporter who's actually heard of and has had the courage to cover this issue.
The Bush administration's open borders policy and its decision to ignore the enforcement of this country's immigration laws is part of a broader agenda. President Bush signed a formal agreement that will end the United States as we know it, and he took the step without approval from either the U.S. Congress or the people of the United States.
It's a deal that few have even heard of.
It's being done again by very few people at the very top on behalf of the investment class, but the working class of people, political officials across our country, from communities, from cities and so forth, they don't know anything about this.
This isn't some trade agreement. It is a total removal of sovereignty from these countries, which will also result in a completely new currency called the Amero.
Fall. Apart from that, I think one thing people who are dollar-based need to focus on is the Amero. That's the one thing that nobody's talking about that I think is going to have a big impact on everybody's life in Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. The Amero is the proposed new currency for the North American community, which is being developed right now between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico to make a borderless community, much like the EU, and the dollar, Canadian dollar, U.S. dollar, and the Mexican peso replaced by the Amero.
By default of this agreement, the American Constitution will eventually be obsolete. You would think that a situation like this would be on the cover of every major newspaper. That is until you realize that the people who are behind this movement are the same people behind the mainstream media, and you are not told what you're not supposed to know. The North American Union is the same concept as the European Union, the African Union, and the soon-to-be Asian Union, and the same people are behind all of them. And, when the time is right, the North American Union, the European Union, the African Union, and the Asian Union will be merged together, forming the final stages of a plan these men have been working on for over 60 years. A one-world government. One bank, one army, one center of power. And if we have learned anything from history, it is that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. This is Aaron Russo, a filmmaker and former politician. To his left is Nicholas Rockefeller of the infamous Rockefeller banking and business dynasty. After maintaining a close friendship with Nicholas Rockefeller, Aaron eventually ended the relationship, appalled by what he had learned about the Rockefellers and their ambitions.
I got a call one day from an attorney woman I knew, and she said, "Would you like to meet one of the Rockefellers?" I said, "Sure, I'd love to." And we became friends, and he began to divulge a lot of things to me. So he said to me one night, he said that there's going to be an event there. And out of that event, you're going to see, we're going to go into Afghanistan, so we can run pipelines from the Caspian Sea. We're going to go into Iraq to take the oil and establish a base in the Middle East. And we're going to go into Venezuela and try and get rid of Chavez. And the first two they've accomplished. Chavez they didn't accomplish. And he said you're going to see guys going into caves looking for looking for people that they're never going to find. You know, he was laughing about the fact that you have this war on terror. There's no real enemy. He's talking about how by having this war on terror, you can never win it because it's an eternal war. And so you can always keep taking people's liberties away. And I said, how are you going to convince people that this war is real? He says, but the media can convince everybody it's real. I mean, you know, it's just that you keep talking about things. You keep saying it over and over and over again, and eventually people believe it. You know, you created the Federal Reserve in 1913 through lies. You create 9/11, which is another lie. Through 9/11, then you're fighting a war on terror, and now all of a sudden you go into Iraq, which was another lie, and now they're going to do Iran. You know, and it's all one thing leading to another, leading to another, leading to another. Now, I would say, what are you doing this for? What's the point of this thing? You have all the money in the world you ever want. You have all the power. I said, you know, you're hurting people. It's not a good thing. And he would say, what do you care about the people for? Take care of yourself and you take care of your family. And then I said to him, what are the ultimate goals here? He said, the ultimate goal is to get everybody in this world chipped with the RFID chip and have all money be on those chips and everything on those chips. And if anybody wants to protest what we do or violate what we want, we just turn off that chip. And if anybody wants to protest what we do or violate what we want, we just turn off that chip.
That's right, microchipped. In 2005, Congress, under the pretense of immigration control and the so-called War on Terrorism, passed the REAL ID Act, under which it is projected by May 2008, you will be required to carry around a federal identification card, which includes on it a scannable barcode with your personal information. However, this barcode is only an intermediary step before the card is equipped with a VeriChip RFID tracking module, which will use radio frequencies to track your every move on the planet. If this sounds foreign to you, please note that the RFID tracking chip is already in all new American passports. And the final step is the implanted chip, which many people have already been manipulated into accepting under different pretenses.
We have a Florida family who are really pioneers in a brave new world. They have volunteered to be the first ever to have microchip identification devices implanted into their bodies.
After 9/11, I was really concerned with the security of my family.
I wouldn't mind having something planted permanently in my arm that would identify me.
In the end, everybody will be locked into a monitored control grid where every single action you perform is documented. And if you get out of line, they can just turn off your chip, for at that point in time, every single aspect of society will revolve around interactions with the chips. This is the picture that is painted for the future if you open your eyes to see it. A centralized one-world economy where everyone's moves and everyone's transactions are tracked and monitored, all rights removed. The most incredible aspect of all. These totalitarian elements will not be forced upon the people. The people will demand them. For the social manipulation of society through the generation of fear and division has completely detached humans from their sense of power and reality. A process which has been going on for centuries, if not millennia. Religion, patriotism, race, wealth, class, and every other form of arbitrary, separatist identification and thus conceit has served to create a controlled population, utterly malleable in the hands of the few. Divide and conquer is the motto, and as long as people continue to see themselves as separate from everything else, they lend themselves to being completely enslaved.
Remember, this power in the earth is the black horse. The newspaper clipping on the left is from when President Woodrow Wilson signed this into law. He later on what to say that he was tricked into doing so. Another interesting fact is that the vote was done while the majority of Congress was on vacation. What this brought into play was this pyramid scheme where very evil men control all the money and all the power and provide nothing positive to the world. If you look to the right, you will see some of the men who run this black horse.
We own and run the Fed. We are your enemy. 1. Lord Jacob D. Rothschild. 2. His son Nathaniel. 3. Baron John D. Rothschild. 4. Sir Evelyn D. Rothschild. 5. David Rockefeller. 6. Nathan Warburg. 7. Henry Kissinger. 8. George Soros. 9. Paul Volcker. 10. Larry Summers. 11. Lloyd Blankfein. 12. Ben Chalam Bernanke.
Occupy Wall Street protesters are on the DHS terrorist watch list. This is a fact, but what about the First Amendment? We need to stand up for our rights or we won't even have the illusion of having rights at all. Never forget, Ben Bernanke, financial terrorist. Yochanan 2:13-15. Now Yahweh's Passover was near, so Joshua went up to Jerusalem, and found those who sold oxen, sheep, and turtle doves, along with others sitting and changing money, in the sacred precincts of the house of Yahweh. And when he had made a whip of small cords, he drove them all out of the sacred precincts of the house of Yahweh, with the sheep and oxen, and poured out the changers' money, and overturned the tables, and said to those who sold turtle doves, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise." Matthew 21:12-13. Then Joshua went into the sacred precincts of the house of Yahweh, and thrust out all those who sold and bought in the sacred precincts, and overthrew the tables of the money changers, with the seats of those who sold doves, and said to them, It is written, My house will be called the house of prayer. But you have made it a den of thieves. Mark 11:15-18. Then they came to Jerusalem, and Joshua went into the sacred precincts of the house of Yahweh, and began to drive out those who bought and sold in the sacred precincts. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves, and would not permit anyone to carry any merchandise through the sacred precincts of the house of Yahweh. And he taught, saying to them, Is it not written, My house will be called the house of prayer for all nations? But you have made it a den of thieves. Now the scribes and chief priests heard it, and sought some way to kill him. We are not going to study the whole lesson of these verses. We will just look at the money changer aspect. What is a money changer in modern times? A banker, a stock exchange employee, a Federal Reserve employee, etc. Now none of these jobs are evil in themselves. It's what one does with this power that makes it evil or not. Also, I want to point out that these bankers that rule over their human peers are the descendants of these money changers. These money changers were Jewish, so are the top bakers in the world today. Nothing against Jewish people. Our Messiah is Jewish. People of any race can be righteous or evil. It is a person-to-person basis. But I want to point out that the people that run the Federal Reserve and the stock exchanges are the descendants of the people who Joshua drove out of the house of Yahweh. Is that monopoly money, or is that the United States legal tender? I can't tell. And behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius. And do not harm the oil and the wine. So I looked, and behold, a pale horse. And the name of him who sat on it was Death, and Hades followed with him. And power was given to them over 1/4 of the earth, to kill with the sword, with hunger, with death, and by the beasts of the earth. NKJV. And I looked, and behold, a pale horse. And the name of him who sat upon it was Death. And Sheol, the grave, followed with him. And power was given to them over 1/4 part of the earth, to kill with the sword, and with hunger, and with pestilence, the same under the authority of the beast of the earth. Book of Yahweh. The word pale is translated from word number 5515 in Strong's Concordance, NT 5515 chloros. Chloros, from the same as NT 5514. Greenish, that is verdant, dun-colored. So we see that the word translated pale means greenish. So the 4th horse, or power that is in the earth at the end times, can be recognized by an affiliation with the color green, has dominion over 1/4 of the earth, and it has these characteristics: it kills with the sword, and with hunger, and with pestilence. We see a number of Islamic countries with green flags. This is because the official color of Islam is green. We also see swords prominently displayed on them. While this is a step in the right direction, it in itself is not enough. Let us see if Islam matches the other attributes of the green horse. This is an article from National Geographic about Islam. Let us look at the words I have highlighted in green. Some 1.3 billion human beings are Muslim, which is 1 person in 5. This article is from 2002 and Islam is the fastest growing religion. Is it possible that since 2002 Islam has gone from 1 person in 5 to 1 person in 4, thus giving more evidence that Islam is the green horse? This information is from the Pew Forum on Religious and Public Life. Revelation 6:8 says a fourth part of the earth. This info is from 2010. Muslims make up 23.2% and the area on the map is also a little under a fourth. Either way you look at it, population or area, both are just under a fourth. Considering the growth rate since 2002 through 2010, it won't be long before Muslims go from 23.2% to 25% or a fourth part of the earth, as Revelation says. The Creator shows you these things so you will know that He is the Mighty One. While not all translations are accurate, when you begin to understand His prophecies, you begin to understand there is true power in Yahweh's word. The following video contains explicit content and may be disturbing to some. There is a warning before the most explicit parts, so if the first few minutes bother you, I would advise not watching when the warning comes on screen.
The Islamists hate everything other than what they are themselves. They killed, for example, over 100,000 Algerians who disagreed with their brand of Islam. These are fellow Muslims.
نقسم بدماء وأشلاء أطفالنا وعذابات أسرانا وسنمضي نفجر أجسادنا.
The radical Muslim group Boko Haram claimed responsibility for this and several more attacks in other parts of Nigeria. In a video released online, he says, "I enjoy killing anyone that God commands me to kill, the way I enjoy killing chickens and rams."
I really would prefer not to talk about Boko Haram's activities. They just make me very uncomfortable.
Is that because you're afraid?
Of course, everybody's afraid. We are all living in fear.
A spokesman for the Islamist group says the deadly attacks won't stop until Sharia law rules the country.
Boko Haram is a jihadist movement that has the same ideology as all other Salafi jihadists, as Al-Qaeda, as the Taliban, as Al-Shabaab. What they want to do is to establish an emirate, an Islamist radical state.
Boko Haram's official name in Arabic means the people committed to propagation of the Prophet's teachings and jihad.
Hamza's a speaker. He brainwashes people. He gets funding. He sends them to commit murder abroad.
Al-Mujahirun is a UK-based Islamic pressure group with offices in Pakistan. 25-year-old Abdul Salam grew up in London's Brick Lane. Now he's a recruiter for the Taliban.
What's your involvement in recruiting and training young British Muslims?
Well, the Muslims from Britain, there's hundreds of them that come over from Britain to Pakistan or Afghanistan. And what we do is we supply them with weapons, clothing, we feed them, we shelter them.
Yeah, I'm British born, British bred.
Are you willing to kill British soldiers?
I'm willing to kill British soldiers simply because of the fact that they're engaging in a war that is against my brotherhood.
The spirit of hatred and killing and slaughter is the spirit of Islam as it is written in the Quran.
Now I have, in one hand, I have the Quran, in the other hand, I have the AK-47 machine gun.
Having the bands of the martyrs, the green bands with Islamic verses on them, chanting 2, 4, 6, 8. We are martyrs. We can wait. Right here in California.
Every Muslim should be a terrorist. Every Muslim should be a terrorist. So I am with those people who are following the Quran. Even if the full world is against them, I am with them.
इस पे कोई शर्मिंदगी या निदामत नहीं है, बल्कि इनको दुश्मन ने इस्लाम समझ के, सहाबा-ए-किराम का दुश्मन समझ के इनको कत्ल किया और इसमें हिस्सा लिए।
मैंने जो यानी ये काम किया है, मैं उसके ऊपर मेरे को फख्र है और मैंने जो काम किया।
إن أشرف الموت هو القتل، وأشرف القتل وأعظم الشهادة هو أن يقتل الإنسان في سبيل الله.
استطعنا بفضل الله عز وجل أن نربي جيلا عقائديا يعشق الموت كما يعشق أعداؤنا الحياة.
كان ورئيسهم والبريطانيين ومن والاهم والصهاينة ربيبة ومصنع الكيان. الله أكبر. لو أذن الله لنا يا أمة محمد سيقول حتى الحجر يا مسلم هذا يهودي خلفي تعال وقع رأسه. ونحن نقطعها والله لا نقطعها أيها اليهود. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الجهاد في سبيل الله. الجهاد في سبيل الله. الجهاد في سبيل الله. محمد رسول الله. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. يا أمة الله. الله أكبر. يا أمة الله.
فهؤلاء وحوش على شكل بشر.
This clip was broadcast on Palestinian TV the day after London suffered 4 suicide terror attacks.
واهلك الكفار والمشركين أعداءك أعداء الدين اللهم احصهم عددا وقتلهم بددا ولا تغادر منهم أحدا.
I condemned completely these terrorist activities.
And then secretly or behind closed doors supporting it.
والجهاد الجهاد الجهاد الجهاد.
What makes Allah happy? Allah is happy when a kafir is killed.
You see the Islamic rule, if a kafir goes into a Muslim country and he's walking by, he's like a cow going, anybody could take him. That is the Islamic rule, and this is the opinion of the fuqaha. It's not my opinion. If you read the books of jihad, you'll see. He went inside, you catch him, what are you doing here? Then he's a boot, you can sell him the market. If Muslims cannot take them to and sell them in the market, then you just kill them. It's okay.
هؤلاء هم الذين يجب أن يذبحوا ويجب أن يقتلوا.
They are killing the infidels just like the preacher in the mosque told them to do. It's their duty to kill them.
تا اسرائیل از صحنه روزگار حذف نشود این فریادها به قوت خود باقی.
In the Middle East, Islam is our identity, it's our political life, it's our social life, it's our life. As a child, I attended Gaza elementary schools, and we were taught that jihad is a religious, holy war for the sake of Allah. That's what it is, to conquer the word for Allah. That is jihad.
These are actual scenes broadcast on Arab television.
لا بد من أن نقيم أنفسنا على دين الله عز وجل وعلى شرع الله سبحانه وتعالى. لا بد أن نربي أبناءنا تربية على حب الجهاد في سبيل الله، حب القتال في سبيل الله.
Daily, my classmates would recite poetry, jihadist poetry. And when they recited it, they were crying. They were wishing shahada, to be shaheed, to die as a martyr, to die in jihad.
إذا أردنا العزة فلا سبيل إلى العزة إلا بالجهاد.
I would summarize the struggle today between radical Islam in the West with the phrase from a Jordanian schoolbook and also Palestinian schoolbook. And the teaching in Islamic education is this religion will destroy all other religions through the Islamic jihad fighters. It's Islam against the other religions. It shows how mainstream some of these concepts which are seen as radical Islam have become or are in the mainstream Arab world today.
Coming out is literally something that comes out of Nazi Germany. Same as in Nazi Germany. The Boy Scouts in Nazi Germany, we had the youth. The youth was being robbed from being youth.
I think the worst form of child abuse is teaching a child to hate. What we have on Palestinian TV and on Saudi TV over and over again are little kids being taught songs, I want to be a suicide bomber.
إذا احتجت على باب القدس أصبحت فدائيا، أصبحت فدائيا بزي مقاتلي، بزي مقاتلي، بزي مقاتلي وشكرا. برافو 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 برافو.
And the youth who are listening to this day and night, what do you expect to happen?
For their own children is even worse.
Mossab Hassan Youssef grew up as Palestinian royalty. He's the son of one of the founders of the Islamic terrorist group Hamas.
It's the authority of the God of the Quran above him. So he's simply doing the will of his God. And my problem, more than any time in the past, is with the God of Quran.
And you've described that as a much different God than the God of the Bible.
To Muslims, the God of the Quran means the God Almighty. Allah, the translation for the word Allah means God, God Almighty. Now, but unfortunately, the God of the Quran, if we compare his personality to the personality of the God of the Bible, we will find the difference. So it doesn't matter if Satan come and appear and tell people, I am God or I'm Jesus Christ, and people start to follow him. This doesn't make him Jesus Christ because he has a name. What matters how he acts. From their fruits, we know them. And the fruits of the God of the Quran is killing, terrorism, beating women, killing children. This is the real fruit of the God of the Quran.
Denn diese Propaganda habe ich ja schon einmal erlebt. Fast 15 Jahre lang war diese Propaganda gegen uns gemacht worden. Propaganda habe ich ja schon einmal erlebt. Fast 15 Jahre lang war diese Propaganda gegen uns gemacht worden. Meine ganzen Parteigenossen erinnern sich dieser Propaganda. Es sind dieselben Worte, dieselben Phrasen. Und wenn wir genauer hinschauen, sogar die gleichen Köpfe. Dasselbe Dialekt. Mit diesen Leuten bin ich fertig geworden. Als ein einsamer, unbekannter Mann.
And I looked, and behold, a pale horse. And the name of him who sat upon it was Death. And Sheol, the grave, followed with him. And power was given to them over a fourth part of the earth, to kill with the sword, and with hunger, and with pestilence, the same under the authority of the beast of the earth. Why do bad things happen to good people? First we must understand the Holy Scriptures. To understand this, 1 Peter 4:12, Beloved, do not be amazed concerning the fiery trial which you must undergo in order to be tested, as though some alien thing were befalling you. Romans 6:16. Do you not know that to whom you yield yourselves as servants to obey, his servants you are whom you obey, whether of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience, which leads to righteousness? Deuteronomy 11:26-28. Behold, I am setting in front of you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing if you obey the laws of Yahweh your Father, which I am giving you this day. Or the curse if you do not obey the laws of Yahweh your Father. Ephesians 5:6. Let no man deceive you by letting you think otherwise, for because of these things, sins, the wrath of Yahweh comes upon the children of disobedience. 1 Yochanan, John 3:7. Little children, let no man deceive you. He who practices righteousness is righteous, just as he is righteous. 1 Yochanan 5:19. We know that we belong to Yahweh, and that the whole world is under the control of the gods, evil ones. 2 Corinthians 12:7-9. There was given me a thorn in my flesh, an angel of Satan to torment me, to keep me from being excessively exalted. I called upon Yahweh 3 times about this thing, to take it away from me. But he said to me, My mercy is enough for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Romans 8:18. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which will be revealed in us. To sum it all up, bad things happen to good people because the world does not follow Yahweh or his instructions. This is what happens when man goes his own way or the way of Satan. When man's governments are destroyed and all go before the throne of Yahweh, there will be no excuse. If Yahweh did not allow man to go his own way, which causes all these curses, man could say, if you had let us do it our way, things would have been fine. By allowing man to choose his own way in this world, Yahweh is showing that any way but his will cause continual destruction that would lead to the extinction of mankind if Yahweh did not intervene. Matthew 24:22-23. For then will be great tribulation, such as has not come to pass since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever will be. And unless those days were shortened, there would no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. So instead of seeing death, murder, oppression, sick children and getting mad or going away from the Creator, you should be disgusted by Satan, as Satan has caused this by teaching rebellion against Yahweh's instruction. Flee from Satan and Satan's ways and turn to Yahweh in the way Yahweh prescribes in his scriptures and not the way the lying religions of this world teach. Acts 3:19. Repent therefore, and be converted, that your sins may be blotted out, that times of refreshing may come from the presence of Yahweh. And it may be that Yahweh may allow things to come upon us. Think about it. For most people, when things are going well, we forget our Creator. It is when things go bad we either turn to Him or get angry. Hebrews 12:11. Now no chastening seems to be joyful at the present time, but grievous. Nevertheless, afterward it produces the peaceable fruit of righteousness, that is, for those who have been trained by it. Remember this, when Yahweh's kingdom is established on earth. Revelation 21:3, 4, And I heard a great voice out of heaven, saying, Behold, the tabernacle of Yahweh is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and Yahweh himself will be with them, and be their Father. And Yahweh will wipe away all tears from their eyes. And there will be no more death, neither sorrow, nor crying, nor will there be any more pain, for the former things have passed away. Revelation 22:12-15. And behold, I come quickly, and my reward is with me, to give every man according as his work will be. I am the first and the last, the beginning and the end. Blessed are those who keep his laws, that they may have right to the tree of life, and may enter in through the gates into the city. For outside are dogs, and sorcerers, and whoremongers. Proves it is not only 10, and murderers, and worshippers of gods, and everyone who professes to love, yet practices breaking the law. Acts 3:19. Repent therefore, and be converted, that your sins may be blotted out, that times of refreshing may come from the presence of Yahweh. Hallelujah! Praise Yahweh! May our King and Savior Yahshua Messiah return quickly. This is part 1 of my Revelation study, which is one of many studies on many topics. If you enjoyed this, request other studies.